Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Chris Dopel. I am the Dean of the Business School and Chair of Colleges here at the University of Notre, Australia in Fremantle. I'll begin by affirming that the University of Notre, Australia acknowledges the traditional owners and custodians of this land. We also pay respect to Noongar elders, both past and present, for they hold the knowledge while maintaining the traditions and culture of their people and this land. On behalf of the Vice-Chancellor of the University, Professor Celia Hammond, allow me to welcome you all to our campus. Several of you have been here before. I just said to William Coleman, it's wonderful to see a full room. It's fantastic. A special welcome to the students from various universities who are here. This is a great day for you in your scholastic development. I'd like to acknowledge our title for the next day, the Australian Sonderweg, between choice, chance and destiny. I was talking about this strange word with William. Ladies and gentlemen, I was raised as a journeyman lawyer, and so I had to reach for my dictionary, but Sonderweg, special way, which William will elaborate upon. This conference is well established. We always have an intriguing theme each year, and William, thank you for putting together the program for us this time. There are a couple of other acknowledgements that I want to make. In particular, I do want to acknowledge the continuing support of the Mannkal Economics Education Foundation, who have stood behind this conference for the several years that it's been running. The University of Notre, Australia is very, very appreciative of this support and the support that Mannkal provides generally for economics students who are pursuing their path in this discipline. We have a variety of speakers today, and William will outline each speaker and their topic, but I would in particular like to welcome and acknowledge Professor Geoffrey Blaney. I spoke with Professor Blaney a few moments ago. Sir, it's an honour to have you at our campus, and we look forward to your keynote speech later in the day. A couple of very brief administrative details, and then I'll hand over to William. If you haven't found them already, toilets. This is very banal. Ladies in the corner there, okay. Gentlemen's back inside that bar area where you met just after registration in the corner, and there's another one out in the courtyard there for the blokes, okay. Lunch in Fairweathers today, which is where you were after registration. That's where we're basically around this building all day, so you don't have to travel far if it starts bucketing down with rain outside. Finally, a special acknowledgement to Professor Gregory Moore of the Notre Dame Business School staff, the chair of the conference committee. Greg is a quiet promoter and organiser, and I think it's very, very important that we acknowledge Greg's continuing role in putting this together, and also the administrative officers of the school for bringing it all together. Enjoy your day. William, over to you, please. Now, we have to play tag with this microphone, really? Yes, so okay. I'll pop that in there, and it's like a baton in the Olympics. You have to pass it on.
Oh, I see. Okay, thanks so much. I wonder if I know how to work this this thing here. Oh, I see. We just use a little arrow system. Okay. Well, thanks so much, Chris. I think it's quite fantastic what the... there we go, okay. Quite fantastic what the University of Notre Dame, Australia, the efforts of Greg Moore and the vision and generosity of Ron Manners and the Mannkal Foundation has wrought today. For today's Freedom to Choose squarely addresses a reality that somehow has not been so squarely addressed in some time, and that is the Australian difference. I put to you that today's Australia's conduct of economic and social policy stands a good deal of distance from the tendency of that conduct of Anglophone economies. And indeed, Australia's difference seems to be increasing in recent years. We seem to be following our own particular track, our own special path, or, to use the German tag, our own Sonderweg. Let me nominate several leading ways which I think there is this difference. We have in Australia a rigidly regulated labour market. The government is heavily dependent on direct taxation, and increasingly so, and on means testing payments. We have what I call a facade federalism. That is to say, there's nominally a federalism, but that belies the establishment of a unitary state. There is a lofty and very forward role given in Australia to the official family of bureaucrats. So the head of the Australian Competition and Consumer Council, the head of the Productivity Commission, and various other regulatory bodies. And finally, Australia has certain electoral singularities which are rarely seen elsewhere in the world. In particular, compulsory and preferential voting, which perhaps some of the students from Notre Dame don't understand, but it's our funny way of doing voting, and indeed a distinct national or rural and regional based party. I mean, one could add more to these differences. We have a national broadcaster funded from general revenue, which no other Anglophone society has. We have a massive compulsory savings scheme, and we have an intensely regulated education sector, where just about every government school in the land is directly run from a Department of Education located in the capital city. And the university sector, I'm afraid to say, experiences an overbearing degree of regulation from Canberra, which is not unknown in the rest of the English-speaking world, certainly. Now, I could sort of flesh it out a bit further, but I think it'd be better to make two general observations about this Australian way. Firstly, when you think of these differences, it seems fairly clear that the difference seems to lie in a preference for a collectivist manner of solving issues and solving problems, in contrast to an individualist manner. Or if I could put it in the familiar political spectrum, from left to right, from collectivist to individualist, it seems that the Australian way consists upon choosing a more left approach to things than other countries. Now, in saying that, I don't want to suggest that the Australian way is, for example, the Australian Labor Party way. That would be a mistake. Or even the Australian Broadcasting Corporation way. That would be a mistake. It's the Australians' way. I put to you that this way has the indulgence and indeed the distinct sympathy of the great bulk of the Australian population. And that is why it has bipartisan support in its essentials. As one political scientist has put it, Australia's various political parties are offering only slightly different brews of the same ideological ingredient. Now, despite that, if you like, bipartisan consensus, this way has sometimes been contested and challenged, and in response hotly defended. But I want to stress that what we're doing today, or the purpose of today's conference, is not to argue over whether the way is a good or a bad thing. It's not to argue over whether it's made Australia wealthier or poorer, wiser or stupider, or kinder or more callous. Rather, the question which we're faced, which this conference is addressing, is why? Why are we that way? What is the explanation of this way? And so, in a few minutes' time, our speakers will begin addressing that question. We will hear a paper by Henry Ergus, which will ponder the classic portrayal of the Australian difference, which is by an Australian historian called W.K. Hancock, who wrote in 1930 a book called Australia, very simply entitled Australia, and which I recommend vigorously for you to read, and it's as stimulating as 1930 as it is today. Then Richard Pomfret will turn to something which is seen often by the rest of the world as something quintessentially Australian, sport. But it will analyse the economic mores of our national pastime and show how distinct they are from the economic mores which govern sport in other countries. After the coffee break, we'll switch to politics, and John Nethercote will address the issue of centralism, and Greg Meleosh will talk about bureaucracy. After lunch, we turn to economics. Peter Yule will take up a thing known as the Harvester case, which was a legendary encounter of more than a century ago that constitutes really the creation myth of the Australian system of industrial regulation. And Nick Cater will present a case study that will bring out the contrast of agricultural practice in the United States and Australia, which I think may well be pregnant in insight with respect to the National Party, that idiosyncratic feature of Australian life which supposedly represents the regional and rural sector of Australia, and which I think is very significant and relevant to this entire way. And finally, we will conclude with Geoffrey Blaney's address, which has the tantalising title, Great Turning Points in Australian History. Well, what is my task in my remaining minutes? Well, it's not to anticipate what our speakers will say, but it will be to cast some organising perspective over attempts to explain the Australian way, and even before that, prior to that, to spend a few minutes to assure ourselves that our inquiry today is well posed, and to forestall three possible objections to the very inquiry on the grounds that you're inquiring into something which doesn't exist, because this Australian way doesn't exist. It's just a phantom, it's just an illusion. So let me dispose of three possible objections to the existence of an Australian way. The first possible objection is that this way is just a passing historical aberration of Australia. In this view, the Australian way is just an expression of what is known by historians of the Australian settlement of 100 years ago, so closely associated with the Prime Minister of the day, Alfred Deakin, and which produced a great mesh of regulation of the Australian economy. But, says this criticism, that settlement was undone. It was undone in the second generation after the Second War. And from 1980, Australia began to normalise, if you can put it that way. Therefore, while once upon a time Australia was fiercely protectionist, but over the past 30 years, trade barriers here have been massively reduced. Once, Australia's banking system consisted of a large federal government bank, a clutch of smaller state banks, and a small suite of tightly regulated private banks. Now, non-government ownership in the financial sector has disappeared, and 66 banks compete with one another. And perhaps most pointedly, whereas once Australia's immigration policy unbendingly sought to secure a so-called white Australia, Australia is now an ethnically diverse society on account of an official immigration policy that has accommodated diversity. To capitulate the position, once Australia was floating down its own little stream, but now it's rejoined the big river. My rebuttal to that criticism is that the shifts that the criticism cites are more a matter of form than of the nature of things. Yes, tariffs have fallen over the past 30 years, but yes, export subsidies have ballooned. Yes, the financial system was deregulated, or at least the banking part of the financial system was deregulated 30 years ago. But about the same time, a massive scheme of compulsory saving was instituted, known as superannuation in Australia. And while the White Australia policy was racist in form, it might be argued that in nature it was more economic, a drastic economic regulation, and that feature hasn't changed. Today, Australia still drastically regulates immigration on economic grounds. Our Department of Immigration is a veritable Soviet planning department in determining, through its skilled occupations list, how many cartographers will be admitted each year to Australia, how many sonographers will be admitted, and how many welders first class will be admitted, not to mention dozens of others of occupations. So rather than being a temporary and passing thing, I would suggest that the way is enduring. And I put to you that this endurance is underlined by the contrast of Australia with two countries which until very recently seemed to travel most of the 20th century in tandem with Australia. And these two countries are Sweden and New Zealand. Both these are, like Australia, small, marginally located, trade-dependent economies composed of a well-educated population working on a favourable resource environment. Both have been historically committed to egalitarianism, just like Australia, with very significant labour parties and with large state involvement. And both, like Australia, began a program of deregulation and dismantling of state structures in the 1980s. The difference which has emerged in the past 20 years between Australia and New Zealand and Sweden is that the market drift of those two latter economies has been deeper and far more enduring. New Zealand has an extremely deregulated financial sector, an extremely deregulated labour market and a cleanly floating currency. And Sweden, let me quote from The Economist, Sweden leads the world in privately run hospitals and schools run by profit-making companies. In the state of Victoria, it is an offence to run a school by a profit-making company, a crime. In my reading, it is Australia's much vaunted and much mythologised period of microeconomic reform of the 1980s that has been passing and temporary. In my reading, we're a country that won't move on. We're a country which is stuck in its way. We are not the world's social laboratory. That was a rhetoric of a century ago. Rather, we seem to be more of a sacred grove, dedicated to the dogged observance of certain jealous gods. Let me deal with a second objection to the very existence of the way. It is misleading to characterise Australia as an outlier to some Anglophone cluster, which is essentially what I have been doing. In this criticism, the various Anglophone economies are strung out along the spectrum in their policy stances. At one end sits Australia, very likely. But at the other end, there will also sit, equally exposed, if you like, the United States, with its own highly deregulated labour markets, its heavy reliance on private health care, its profusion of non-government universities. We would be just as entitled to speak of an American special case as an Australian one. The United States, I believe, is the only developed economy which does not have a statutory annual leave requirement. Let the United States be deemed the outlier and puzzled over, it might be said. The relative normalisation of Australia, which that sentiment expresses, might be reinforced by another observation that is distinct, but which operates in the same direction. That there is a distinct tendency of all countries in the world to swing one way or another in their policy stances. So in trying to understand and explain policy stances, our first point of reference should not be the society or the country, but the epoch, the age. We should be contrasting the age of Keynes with the age of Friedman. We shouldn't be making some sort of contrast between the antipodes, where people apparently stand on their policy heads, with the normality on the other side of the earth, and, or to put it even more pointedly, if policy in Australia has deteriorated over the past 15 years, hasn't it done the same all over the world? I think the best response to that scepticism about the Australian way is not to deny its elements of truth, but to criticise its relevance. We see that there is this co-movement in policy across all countries without relinquishing the key claim of the way, that Australia sits at an extremity and by no small degree. A third, more destructive scepticism about the existence of the way would say that no country's policy array sits compactly on some point of the political spectrum. In reality, the policies of each country are sprawled right across the spectrum. Indeed, this criticism might go far to assert that each country is extreme in at least one dimension in policy. In the United Kingdom, it is the National Health Service. Okay? This completely collectivised provision of health, which is solid support of the people of Great Britain. Indeed, it's been described as the established religion of Great Britain. In the United States, we could cite sugar, which is an intensely protected market, or the elimination of common law remedies in New Zealand. The upshots would say this criticism is that every country constitutes some sort of special way. We have a British way, a New Zealand way, an American way, just as much as an Australian way. How to respond? Well, I think examples such as the National Health Service in the United Kingdom, or sugar in the United States, etc., will certainly be a counter to any attempt to explain the Australian way purely by reference to some supposed Australian penchant for collectivist approaches to problems and issues. Yet the existence of the National Health Service does not take away or remove the singularities that I instanced at the beginning of this talk. They still constitute a difference. They still crave an explanation. What would be subversive of the usefulness of the concept of the Australian way would be if there was no underlying condition of which those singularities are manifestations. If you like, if there was no disease of which these manifestations are a symptom of. If rather these singularities are just a jumble of disconnected accidents. In that case, the way is not really a way at all. It's not a mode of doing things. It is just a difference. So I think that in explaining the difference, we are putting our finger on what the way is. In my remaining minutes, I want to take up more directly the question which this conference seeks to answer. Why is Australia the way it is? Now, as I said, I won't try to anticipate what our speakers will say, but rather I'd like to provide a little bit of organising framework on the kind of categories of explanation which might be advanced for the Australian way. And there'll be two such categories which I'll propose. What I call the cultural historical category of explanation and the economic environmental category of explanation. The first type, the cultural historical category of explanation, invokes culture or value or custom to explain, well, whatever country you're examining. Of course, to invoke culture is really to beg the question, isn't it? Well, why do we have this culture? And those who invoke culture tend to answer that question by invoking the legacy of history or some sort of founding history. So we might call these cultural historical explanations. To illustrate very easily, we can think about the United States or the Americas more generally. If, for example, we were to ask, well, why is the United States of America different from the United Mexican States, as Mexico was formerly known? Some might be tempted to invoke the different origins of those two societies. In the United States, the Mayflower Pilgrims; in Mexico, conquistadors. Clearly, there's a great cultural load there. Now, whatever you think of that, my point is to illustrate a simple attempt at a cultural historical explanation of the differences in countries. Now, clearly, Australia's origin as a British military penal colony invite explanations in terms of these cultural historical categories. Thus, the ways attachment for solution by regulation could be traced to an authoritarianism supposedly instilled by the character of a prison and barrack society. Thus, E.O.G. Shan, surely the most eloquent critic of the way, wrote that more of Australia than the crooked streets of Sydney can be traced to the period of military rule at her origins. The way's penchant for bureaucracy might be traced to the fact that Australia originated as a colony. And here, let me just give you that quote. Possibly the most enduring feature of any colonial regime, one of the first to appear and one of the last to leave, is the administrator, the colonial bureaucrat, high, middle and low. That's said by two scholars regarding Latin America, but I think it has possibly some resonance for Australia. More speculatively, I wonder whether the example of Australian history of early conscientious and elevated governors, Macquarie, Brisbane, Burke, Arthur, may have provided implicit archetypes for that procession of dutiful, intelligent, and, let it be said, very forward public servants that have been so conspicuous in Australian history and almost constitute an Australian type. A third, more benign historical cultural explanation of the way in Australia might be found in the confluence of convictism with the Chartism of gold rush immigrants of the 1850s, which, it might be argued, yields an egalitarianism. Here lies probably the most influential explanation of the way. It's an expression of the ethic of mateship, formed by the shedding of old class markers by the lower strata of Great Britain in this new society. But the fact that Australia has British origins illustrates how tricky these cultural historical explanations can be. For the significance of Australia's British 19th century heritage could be interpreted very differently. Early and mid-Victorian Britain was very obviously a highly individualist society, and accordingly her colonial progeny in Australasia were a quarrelsome and feuding lot, as the briefest acquaintance of its records will reveal. The Eureka Stockade was, of course, a tax revolt. In sympathy with those facts, the eminent Australian historian, economic historian, R.N. Hartwell, insisted that it was the essential liberalism and capitalism of Industrial Revolution Britain that made Australia, and which, by dissolving the early military state, generated in its place the massive and economic political development in the half-century from the 1830s. Now, Hartwell might well have been right, but then, if he is right, we can hardly use the British heritage to explain why I've called the way. There are a couple of moves which the advocate of the cultural historical category of explanation might make in the face of that impasse. They could observe that when we invoke history to explain culture, that year zero, so to speak, that year zero, that year history supposedly unloads its burden on posterity, that doesn't have to be literally the first year in that society's annals. For society's norms might be reforged at some later date in the crucible of some crisis. And here some cultural historical theorists of the way will hold up the traumas of 1890s Australia as supposedly dissolving the liberal norms of Great Britain and hammering them into a quite different cast. That decade was, of course, the genesis of our singular industrial relations system, federation, the Labor Party. Of course, any effort of cultural explanations to shift the year zero to some supposed crucible crisis period in some way makes culture a malleable thing, a thing which is explained rather than a thing which is explaining. And to some degree, it gives the game away to that alternative category of explanation which I proposed, namely the economic environmental category. This second category of explanation, the economic environmental, might begin with the observation that values are traditions. In Australia, in a country lacking traditions, well, frankly, is lacking in values. In the absence of values, Australia has been driven by economic motivations. But economic motivations can only really decide things in conjunction with material constraints, or if you like, the material environment or the environment. So the economic environmental explanation is led to point the finger at the various idiosyncratic features of Australia's material environment. And what might they be? Well, I want to put to you that probably two are the likely candidates. The first is our population or lack of it. We are in a big space but a very small population. We're a small-scale society. We're a small-scale society. That small-scaleness will lend itself to monopoly, okay, in both goods and factor markets. That small-scale society, social theorists will suggest, will always facilitate collective action. Collective action is less undermined by defection in small groups than in large groups. So maybe it's just that we're so small, which is important here. But I think the second one I'm going to cite is probably the most popular one. It is the bush, okay? The outback, the back of beyond. That enormous quantity of low and risky value land, studded by, an important detail, outcrops of land made precious by their mineral content. In this view, it is the outback of drought, flood and fire that makes Australia different. That makes Australia, for example, not New Zealand. It is the outback that makes for the Australian way. And by two channels. Firstly, the great distances in Australia make collective action more appealing, possibly even more rational, particularly with respect to monopolies of transport, natural monopolies of transport, and communication. And the political agent of collective action to conquer that space historically has been the National Party, which has keenly supported all government investment in communications and transport infrastructure, including the Post Office, of course, and let it not be forgotten, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. Secondly, that large quantity of land makes rents per head high. And high rents look like a pile of wealth that might be divided up as one pleases, without diminishing the size of that pile. To put it in terms of the language of first-year economics, an economy of vertical supply curves is very encouraging of a collectivist approach to policy. Now, this case for the bush as an economic environmental explanation of the way is plausible but hardly irresistible. It is embarrassed by the fact that Australia is, after all, pronouncedly urban. It is also troubled by the fact that New Zealand, lacking that outback, so closely shared the Australian way for 90 years. So I guess I'll conclude by remarking that attempts at simple answers to our question seem to end in perplexity as much as enlightenment. And on that thought, it might be appropriate to cue the more elaborate analyses of our speakers to come. And so at this point, I'd like to lead to Henry Ersk's paper on Australia. Now, I should explain that family circumstances have prohibited Henry attending today, but very kindly, Jonathan Pincus, who is a professor of economic history at the University of Adelaide and a several-time collaborator with Henry Ersk's, research collaborator, has kindly agreed to present Henry's paper. Thank you very much, Jonathan.